years old when this happened. At the time, I worked for a cleaning contractor in a corporate office building on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. It was one of those modern 10-story office buildings occupied by multiple companies during the day, but practically deserted after 7 in the evening. Most of the time, I worked the overnight shift alone. My job was simple: collect trash, clean restrooms, vacuum carpets, and check common areas before employees arrived in the morning. I had been working in that building for nearly 8 months and knew every hallway, every door, and even the normal sounds of the air conditioning system. That particular week, the 8th floor remained closed because of a renovation project that had been dragging on for months. The elevators were not even supposed to stop there without special authorization. I knew that because the supervisors constantly reminded everyone not to access that floor for safety reasons. It was quite cold outside that night, but inside the building the temperature was comfortable. I had one earbud in while working and followed my normal routine, never imagining that it would become the strangest night of my life. Around 1 in the morning, I was finishing up the 9th floor. While pushing my cleaning cart down the main corridor, I heard the familiar sound of the elevator arriving. That was not unusual. What caught my attention was that about a minute later I heard the same sound again. Then again. At first I did not think much of it. I assumed some system might be running tests or something similar, but when I passed by the reception area on that floor, I saw the elevator display repeatedly changing to the number 8. The elevator would go down, stop at the lobby, go up to the 8th floor, come back down, and then repeat the entire cycle again. I stood there watching for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. There were no employees in the building at that hour. The security officer who monitored the cameras worked from another company location several miles away. I was literally the only authorized person inside that building that night, yet the elevator kept receiving calls to a floor that was supposed to be completely empty. I remember feeling an odd sense of discomfort in my stomach at that moment, though I was still trying to find a logical explanation. I went downstairs to the small monitoring room located next to the building's administration office. It was not exactly a security center, just a room with a few monitors connected to the building's cameras. I often used that space to check areas before turning off certain lights at the end of my shift. When I arrived, the elevator was still making the same trip. I decided to pull up the camera feed from the 8th floor just to confirm that nobody was there. At first, the image appeared completely empty. The main lights on that floor had been off for months, so the camera showed only dark hallways partially illuminated by emergency lighting. I watched for several seconds without seeing anything. Then the elevator doors appeared in the frame and slowly opened. I expected to see an empty elevator. Instead, I saw someone step out. To this day, I remember the immediate feeling in my chest when I realized what I was looking at. The image quality was poor and grainy, but it was clearly a person. The individual wore dark clothing and walked slowly out of the elevator. They did not look like a renovation worker. They were not carrying tools or equipment. They simply exited and disappeared among the dark partitions on the floor. My first thought was that it might be someone with special access, but that made no sense at that hour. I spent the next few minutes trying to convince myself there was a normal explanation. Maybe a maintenance worker had entered without me noticing. Maybe a manager had authorization to access the closed floor. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I grabbed my radio and tried contacting the remote security center. No one answered. Later, I learned there had been a temporary communication issue at that location. At the time, however, I did not know that. I was alone. Looking back at the monitors, I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. The person no longer appeared on any of the 8th floor cameras. It was as if they had simply vanished after leaving the elevator. I knew that floor had only one main staircase and the elevator itself. There was no other exit. After several minutes of hesitation, I decided to go up. My reasoning was simple. If someone was really there, they could be an intruder or someone trying to steal renovation equipment. I grabbed my flashlight, left my cleaning cart in the hallway, and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, I felt a kind of nervousness that is hard to describe. It was not exactly fear yet. It was more the sense that something about the situation did not fit. When the elevator reached the 8th floor, the doors opened onto a corridor that was almost completely dark. The only illumination came from a few emergency lights scattered along the walls, creating patches of shadow between the temporary construction partitions. The air felt different up there. There was a strong smell of dust, dried paint, and cut wood that did not exist on the other floors. As soon as I stepped out of the elevator, I could hear only the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. I stood still for a few seconds, listening for movement. Nothing. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, revealing plastic sheets covering furniture, drywall panels leaning against walls, and tools left behind by construction workers. I remembered what the floor looked like during the day when the renovation crew was present. Now it felt like a completely different place. Too quiet, too empty. Even so, I began walking slowly down the main corridor, calling out in case someone was really there. I asked if they needed help, or if they were a maintenance employee. No one answered. The sound of my own voice felt strange in that dark open space. I was already thinking about turning back when I heard a noise deeper inside the floor. It was footsteps, not running footsteps or someone trying to escape. Slow, measured footsteps, as if someone were calmly walking across dust-covered carpet. The sound came from the area where the old conference rooms were located, behind a row of temporary partitions installed during the renovation. I stopped immediately. My heart started beating faster at once. I tried to determine whether it could be some building noise, but it did not sound like one. The footsteps continued, 3 or 4 of them, then silence, then a few more. What unsettled me was not simply hearing someone there. It was the impression that the person moved exactly when I moved. When I took a few steps forward, the sounds returned a few seconds later. When I stopped, the sounds stopped as well. At one point, I even switched off my flashlight for a few seconds to listen more carefully. In the near total darkness, I clearly heard a single footstep somewhere ahead of me, a muffled but unmistakable sound. And at that moment, I had the very clear feeling that whoever was there knew exactly where I was. I stood there trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to return to the elevator and wait until I could reach security. But another part kept insisting that it was probably a maintenance worker, someone left behind after hours, or even a homeless person who had somehow gotten into the building. I kept searching for normal explanations because the alternative was admitting that the situation was becoming far too strange. I decided to move forward a few more yards. The flashlight illuminated only fragments of the environment: dismantled desks, stacks of boxes, hanging electrical cables, and plastic sheets swaying slightly from circulating air. As I walked, I began noticing something I had not seen before. There were recent marks in the dust on the floor. Not many, but they were visible. Footprints. I crouched down to examine them more closely. They appeared relatively recent because they were clearly defined. I followed them with the beam of my flashlight for several feet until they disappeared behind a row of temporary partitions. The problem was that I could not see any footprints leading back the other way. It was as though someone had walked into that area and simply ceased to exist. I took a deep breath and slowly moved around the partitions. My entire body was tense by then. I could feel my shoulders stiff and my hands gripping the flashlight tightly. When I illuminated the area behind the partitions, I found only an old open office space that was completely empty. There was no one there. There was not even a reasonable place for someone to hide quickly. I was scanning the room when I heard a distant metallic sound from the far side of the floor. It sounded like a door closing slowly. The noise echoed through the entire level. I immediately swung my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Just darkness. Then I heard footsteps again, this time faster, not running but clearly moving away. The sound crossed a series of interior corridors and vanished. Without thinking, I started following it. Looking back now, I realize how bad of an idea that was. I was alone, unable to contact anyone, and chasing an unknown person through a closed floor. But at that moment, curiosity and adrenaline were stronger than common sense. As I moved through the dark corridors, I started noticing small things out of place. A chair tipped over that I was sure had not been there a few days earlier. An empty water bottle sitting on a dust-covered desk. A crumpled snack bag near a wall. The more I observed, the more it seemed like someone had been using that floor occasionally without authorization. That worried me for a different reason. If someone really had been hiding there, they could have been watching my schedule for weeks. I kept walking until I reached the northern end of the floor, where several executive offices still awaited renovation. That was when I heard another sound, very faint. So faint that I almost thought I imagined it. It sounded like someone breathing. Not heavy breathing, just slow and steady. I stopped immediately. The feeling I had in that moment is difficult to explain. It was no longer just fear. It was the uncomfortable certainty that I was extremely close to someone without being able to see them. The breathing seemed to be coming from one of the dark offices to my right, and for the first time that night I seriously considered the possibility that I was not the one searching for that person. Maybe it was exactly the opposite. I remained motionless for several seconds, trying to confirm whether I was truly hearing it. The silence on that floor was so complete that every sound seemed amplified. The breathing continued from the same direction. Slow, regular, almost too calm. The office from which the sound seemed to come was completely dark. The door stood partially open, leaving only a black gap visible between the hallway and the interior. I pointed my flashlight toward it, but I could not make out much beyond shadows and furniture covered with plastic sheets. My throat felt dry at that moment. I remember swallowing several times while trying to decide what to do. The idea of entering that office alone seemed absurd. At the same time, I could not simply turn away knowing someone might be hiding inside. Eventually, I called out again, this time more firmly. I said that I had seen the person on the cameras and that security would be contacted. The breathing stopped immediately. It did not fade. It did not grow quieter. It simply stopped. The reaction sent an instant chill through me. It was as if whoever was inside had heard every word and decided to remain perfectly still. I kept watching the doorway for perhaps 20 or 30 seconds. It felt much longer. No movement. No sound. I finally approached slowly. Each step caused the carpet to produce faint, muffled noises. When I reached the door, I pushed it open with my foot and shined the flashlight inside. The room was empty. There were only dismantled desks, construction boxes, and 2 windows covered by wooden panels. My first feeling was relief. My second was confusion. I was absolutely certain I had heard someone breathing in there. There was no doubt in my mind. I swept the flashlight across every corner and then noticed something strange near the back wall. An old mattress was folded behind several boxes. Beside it were 2 water bottles, a black backpack, and food wrappers. None of it belonged to the renovation project. Someone had been there recently, maybe many times. That discovery completely changed the situation in my mind. I was no longer looking for a lost employee. I was probably standing inside the hideout of someone who had been occupying that floor without authorization. From that moment on, the feeling of being watched became much stronger. I left the room and constantly looked over my shoulder as I walked. My flashlight seemed weaker than before. Or maybe it was simply my growing nervousness. The corridor remained empty, but something felt wrong. I would walk a few yards and think I saw movement at the edge of the light. Whenever I pointed the flashlight directly at it, there was nothing there. At one point, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around immediately. Nothing. Just an empty corridor. Then I heard another sound, this time clearly coming from the other side of the floor. One footstep, then another. Whoever it was no longer trying to hide. The footsteps came slowly and far apart, as if someone were deliberately moving between the partitions. The worst part was that I could not determine the exact distance. Sometimes they sounded close. Other times they seemed far away. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my neck. That was when I decided to stop trying to investigate on my own. I just wanted to get back to the elevator, go downstairs, and call the police. I began retracing my steps through the same route I had used to enter that section of the floor. I tried to stay calm and walk normally, but in reality, I was almost speeding up. The problem was that the sounds continued. Every time I passed a row of partitions or a side corridor, I heard some distant movement. It was never constant enough for me to locate the source. It was only enough to remind me that another person was probably somewhere on that floor. When I finally saw the main area near the elevators, I felt immediate relief. I was maybe 40 yards away when I heard a loud crash behind me. It sounded like something heavy hitting the floor. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. Then, at that exact moment, I heard footsteps. This time they were fast, much faster than before. They were not coming directly toward me, but they were moving between the partitions parallel to the main corridor, as if someone were matching my movement without ever stepping into view. It was the first time that night I felt real fear. Not the initial discomfort or nervous curiosity. Real fear. The kind that makes your stomach drop and your mind stop searching for logical explanations. I practically crossed the final distance to the elevator. I pressed the call button repeatedly while looking over my shoulder. The corridor remained empty, but I could still hear movement coming from the dark renovation areas. When the doors finally opened, I stepped inside immediately and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors began closing. Then something happened that still unsettles me when I remember it. Just before the doors met completely, I saw a silhouette emerge from between two partitions at the far end of the corridor. The distance was too great for me to identify any facial features, but it was clearly a person. Tall, thin, standing still, just watching, not running, not shouting, doing nothing at all. The figure remained motionless as the doors finished closing. The image lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough to send a cold sensation down my spine. During the ride down, I stared at the floor numbers on the panel without being able to think clearly. When the elevator reached the lobby, I hurried out and went straight to the administrative area, where I finally managed to use a phone line to call the local police. The officers arrived about 20 minutes later. I explained everything that had happened and showed them the camera recordings. The problem was that several of the recordings were no longer available. The building's system recorded in short cycles, and some cameras were malfunctioning because of the renovation work. Even so, one of the recordings clearly showed someone exiting the elevator on the 8th floor. The officers went upstairs to investigate while I remained in the lobby. I remember watching the clock constantly. It felt like hours, but it was only about 30 minutes. When they returned, they informed me that they had found clear signs that someone had been occupying part of the floor. There was food, clothing, blankets, and other personal belongings hidden in 2 different rooms. However, they found no one. What bothered me most was one observation made by one of the officers. According to him, some of the items they found appeared to have been used only a few hours earlier. Whoever had been there had probably left very shortly before the search. Maybe while I was still on the floor. Maybe while I was following those footsteps through the dark corridors. The next day, the building management reviewed the access records and discovered something even stranger. Someone had been using an old access card belonging to a former employee who had been terminated months earlier to enter restricted areas of the building on multiple nights. They never discovered exactly who had been using that card. The police investigated for a while, but as far as I know, the case was never fully solved. I continued working in that building for a few more weeks, but I never again agreed to go up to the 8th floor alone. Shortly afterward, I requested a transfer to another contract. To this day, I still try to rationalize everything that happened that night. It was probably just someone living secretly inside the building and trying to avoid being discovered. That is the most logical explanation. But what continues to bother me is not the fact that someone was there. It is remembering those footsteps that always seemed to occur whenever I moved. The breathing that stopped the moment I spoke, and especially the constant feeling that the person knew exactly where I was the entire time. If I had continued exploring those corridors for a few more minutes instead of heading back to the elevator, I honestly do not know what would have happened, and maybe it is better that I never find out. Story 2. I was 27 years old when this happened, and at the time I worked as the overnight receptionist at a small emergency clinic on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. It was not a large hospital that stayed busy around the clock. It was a rural clinic that handled minor accidents, urgent medical issues, and patients referred from small towns throughout the region. During the day, there were enough doctors, nurses, technicians, and receptionists to keep everything running smoothly. But during the overnight shift, the staff was reduced to the bare minimum. On that particular night, a nurse and a doctor were resting in rooms at the back while I managed the reception area alone. It was an extremely cold winter night. Snow had been falling since early evening, and there was almost no traffic on the roads. I had been working since 10 o'clock and up to that point had only checked in 2 patients. The clinic was quiet. The air carried that constant smell of cleaning products mixed with stale coffee drifting from the break room. Most of the reception lights were turned off to save energy during the night, leaving the area illuminated only by the main desk and the internal hallways. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the automatic entrance doors opened. I looked up from my computer expecting to see someone who appeared ill or in need of urgent medical attention. Instead, a man entered alone. He looked to be in his 50s. He wore a heavy dark jacket, winter boots, and a plain cap. What immediately caught my attention was the way he entered. He did not seem like someone seeking medical help. He walked slowly, observing the interior of the clinic as he approached the desk. When he reached the reception counter, he casually stated that he had been referred to that facility and that they were expecting him. I asked for his name and date of birth so I could locate his records. He provided the information without hesitation. I began searching the system while he stood silently on the other side of the counter. The problem was that no record existed. No scheduled appointment, no referral, no medical notes. I searched again using only his last name, then only his date of birth. Nothing appeared. As I continued searching, I noticed that the man remained completely still, watching me in silence. It began making me uncomfortable in a way I could not explain. I continued checking the system for several more minutes. Communication errors occasionally occurred between clinics in the region, so at first I did not think it was impossible that a referral had been entered incorrectly. While typing, I tried to keep a normal conversation going. I asked which doctor had referred him and which town he had come from. The man answered vaguely. He simply said they had sent him there that night and that someone on the staff would know what it was about. The response did not help at all. What began to bother me was his behavior. He did not seem worried, impatient, or in pain. Most people who arrived at that clinic during the night showed some sign of physical discomfort or anxiety. He did not. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, staring at me steadily. At one point, I looked down at the monitor for a few seconds while trying to locate an old record. When I looked back up, he was still standing in exactly the same position. He did not even seem to have moved. The situation was becoming strange enough that I considered waking the nurse on duty and having her personally check the case. Then the reception phone rang. It was an internal call from one of the observation rooms. I answered and heard the nurse asking whether a new patient had arrived because she had heard the automatic doors open a few minutes earlier. I told her yes and briefly explained the situation. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. When I hung up and looked up again, the man was gone. At first, I assumed he had sat down in the waiting area. I looked at the chairs. Nothing. I checked near the entrance. Nothing. The automatic doors remained closed, indicating that no one had just left. My first thought was that he had gone to the restroom, but something immediately caught my attention. Behind the desk was a monitor displaying the clinic's internal security cameras. When I looked at the reception camera feed, I could clearly see the moment when I answered the phone. The man was still standing at the counter. Then while I was talking, he simply turned and walked toward the internal hallway leading to the examination rooms. My stomach dropped instantly. That area was restricted. Patients were not allowed to wander there unaccompanied, and I was certain that the access door had been locked only minutes earlier. I immediately stood up and walked to the door separating the reception area from the clinical section. It was slightly open. That alone was a problem. The door remained electronically locked during overnight hours, specifically to prevent patients from entering the hallways unattended. I clearly remembered hearing it lock when my shift began. I slowly pushed it open and looked inside. The main hallway was empty. The night lights remained on, but at reduced brightness. It was that dim white lighting typical of hospitals during the early morning hours. The environment was silent. I could hear only the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of a heart monitor coming from an unused room that remained powered on for testing. I called out the name the man had given me. No response. I called again, louder. Nothing. For a few seconds, I considered the possibility that he had opened the door by mistake and returned to reception without me noticing. But when I looked back, the desk was still empty. The uneasy feeling I had already been experiencing intensified quickly. It made no sense for someone to enter a clinic in the middle of the night, disappear from reception, and begin wandering through employee-only corridors. I grabbed my internal radio and informed the nurse that the man had entered the restricted area. She replied that she was leaving the break room and would meet me in a few minutes. In the meantime, I decided to check the nearest hallways. The clinic was not large. There were only a handful of examination rooms, observation rooms, and administrative offices connected by two main corridors. I walked slowly, looking into every open doorway. All of them were empty. Some rooms were completely dark. Others were illuminated only by small lights from powered equipment. The place felt even quieter than before. As I moved farther down the hall, I began experiencing the kind of nervousness that makes you pay attention to every sound. The noise of my own footsteps seemed too loud. At one point, I passed an examination room whose door was partially open. When I shined my phone's flashlight inside, I noticed something strange. A chair that normally sat against the wall was positioned directly in the center of the room. It may sound insignificant, but I walked past that room every night. I knew exactly how those rooms were usually arranged. Someone had moved that chair recently, and for some reason, it gave me a very bad feeling. I continued walking until I reached the farthest section of the clinic, where 3 old examination rooms were located, and were almost never used during the overnight shift. The lighting there was even dimmer. Motion-activated lights controlled that hallway, and some took several seconds to turn on. That was when I saw something at the end of the corridor. At first, I thought it was just a shadow caused by the uneven lighting. Then I realized it was a silhouette partially visible between 2 open doorways. It looked like someone standing there watching the hallway. I froze immediately. The figure was too far away for me to identify facial features, but it was tall and motionless. I stared for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. The person did not move, did not speak, simply remained there. My first instinct was to call out the name the man had given me at reception. Before I could, one of the motion lights finally switched on. The sudden brightness illuminated the entire area for a moment, and at that instant I realized the figure was no longer there. The space was empty. Both doors remained open, but there was no one standing between them. I stood there for several seconds trying to understand what had just happened. My first reaction was to rationalize it. I thought perhaps I had mistaken a shadow for a person. The lighting in that hallway really was poor, and I was tired after being awake for so many hours. At the same time, I knew what I had seen. It had not looked like a shadow. It had looked like someone watching from one of the examination rooms. While I continued staring at the area, I heard footsteps behind me. I nearly jumped before realizing it was the nurse approaching from the main corridor. I quickly explained everything that had happened since the man arrived at reception. She was concerned as well. Not so much because of the strange details, but because an unknown person was wandering through areas containing medications, equipment, and medical records. We decided to check every room together. Having another person there made me feel slightly better. We started with the nearest examination rooms and opened each door one by one. Everything appeared normal. No hidden patient, no intruder, no obvious signs of someone moving around inside. Yet the feeling that someone was still somewhere in the building refused to go away. When we reached the final hallway, we found something that immediately caught our attention. One of the emergency exit doors was unlocked. That was highly unusual. The door led to a side section of the parking lot used only by staff and suppliers. It was supposed to remain alarmed during the night. The nurse quickly checked the security panel and discovered that the system had registered the door opening about 5 minutes earlier. The timing matched almost exactly with the period when the man disappeared from reception. For the first time, we considered that he might have simply entered the clinic, wandered through the hallways, and left through that door. It was a logical explanation, but there was a problem. When we opened the exit and looked outside, snow still covered the entire parking lot. There were old tire tracks and some employee footprints from hours earlier. However, there were no recent footprints leading away from that door. None. The layer of snow remained untouched immediately beyond the threshold. The nurse and I exchanged a glance immediately. If someone had really used that exit only minutes earlier, there should have been visible tracks. By that point, the doctor had also been awakened and joined the search. The three of us spent nearly 40 minutes checking every room, closet, and administrative area in the clinic. We found no one. When we returned to reception, I decided to review the camera footage from the moment the man arrived. That was when we noticed something that still bothers me to this day. The main camera clearly showed the man entering the clinic, speaking with me and standing at the counter. Then it showed him walking toward the internal hallway. But at no point did it show the electronic access door opening. It was as though he simply appeared on the other side of the door between one frame and the next. It was not anything supernatural, most likely a camera glitch or synchronization issue. But it made it even harder to understand exactly how he had gotten through. The strangest detail came afterward. While reviewing the footage, the doctor pointed out that the man seemed to glance repeatedly toward the clinic's internal hallways throughout the entire conversation. Not at me, not at the computer, always toward the corridors behind the desk, as if he were searching for something specific. Local police arrived a few hours later and documented the incident as a trespassing case. They reviewed the footage, collected the name the man had provided, and attempted to locate any matching records. They found nothing corresponding to that identity in the area. The name was apparently false. No identification had been presented. No vehicle license plate had been captured by the exterior cameras because of the snowstorm that night. The case was eventually closed without identifying the individual. I continued working at that clinic for more than a year afterward, but I never forgot that night. What disturbs me most is not the disappearance itself. Strange people show up at clinics and hospitals more often than most people realize. What bothers me is the way he behaved, the absolute calmness, the fact that he showed no interest whatsoever in receiving medical treatment, and especially the feeling I had when I saw that silhouette watching the hallway of empty examination rooms. To this day, when I think about that night, I get the impression that the man did not enter the clinic looking for help. I have the feeling that he entered looking for something else, something he knew very well. And for some reason, once he realized he would not find what he was looking for, he simply left before anyone could discover who he really was. Story 3. I was 31 years old when this happened, and at the time I worked the overnight shift at a distribution center near Great Falls, Montana. The facility was located outside the city, surrounded by empty land, a few agricultural areas, and long stretches of road where almost nobody passed during the night. My job was relatively simple. I organized incoming and outgoing shipment records, verified driver's documentation, and prepared the loading docks for the morning deliveries. During the day, the warehouse was busy, full of forklifts, trucks, and employees. But after midnight, almost everything became empty. That night, I was the only employee in the building. The supervisor had left shortly before 1 in the morning, and the next shift would not arrive until around 6. I was already used to that environment. The warehouse had its normal sounds, the ventilation system running, the occasional creak of metal structures reacting to temperature changes, and the distant hum of industrial refrigerators. It was early winter and it was extremely cold outside. The wind constantly struck the walls of the warehouse and sometimes produced strange noises that had simply become part of the routine. Around 3 in the morning, I was sitting in the small administrative office located above the loading docks. From there, I could observe most of the yard through large windows facing the exterior area. I was reviewing some delivery records when I noticed headlights slowly approaching through the main entrance of the property. That immediately caught my attention because there were no scheduled arrivals at that hour. Normally, overnight trucks either notified us in advance or appeared in the system. I watched as the vehicle passed through the gate and entered the yard. It was a large truck, completely white, with no visible logos on its sides. Instead of heading toward the illuminated loading docks, it continued moving slowly until it reached a more isolated section of the property near the fenced perimeter. Then it simply stopped. The engine remained running for a few seconds before shutting off. I expected the driver to get out and look for the office or ask for directions. But that never happened. The truck remained motionless. Its headlights were off. There was no visible movement around it. At that moment, I assumed the driver had either gotten the wrong address or was checking some information before approaching the docks. I continued watching the truck for several minutes while accessing the internal system to see if there had been any last-minute updates. I found nothing. No emergency delivery, no notice from headquarters, and no scheduled arrival for that time. I decided to zoom in on one of the exterior cameras facing the yard. The image quality was not perfect, but it was good enough to read the truck's front license plate. I wrote down the number and checked it against the list of authorized carriers we normally use to verify access. That was when I found the first truly strange detail. The plate did not correspond to any company associated with the transportation documents typically servicing our region. In fact, the search indicated a company from another state with no connection whatsoever to our distribution center. I considered that it might simply be a rented or subcontracted vehicle. That happens frequently in logistics. Even so, something felt off. The truck remained parked in exactly the same location, with nobody leaving the cab or attempting to contact the office. The behavior simply made no sense for someone making a legitimate delivery. While finishing my records check, I heard a metallic sound coming from the lower level of the warehouse. At first, I assumed it was one of the building's normal noises. Then I heard it again. This time, more clearly, it sounded like a heavy door moving. I immediately stood up and walked to the window. The truck was still parked in the same dark section of the yard. But when I shifted my attention to the loading dock area, I noticed something that made my stomach drop instantly. One of the side access doors to the warehouse was open. Not fully open, but enough for me to notice a dark gap where there had previously only been a closed metal surface. I had passed by that door less than half an hour earlier during a routine inspection. I was absolutely certain it had been locked. My first thought was that perhaps I had forgotten to secure it properly. But the more I thought about it, the less I believed that explanation. Checking those doors was part of my nightly responsibilities, and I always made sure they were secured. Now, standing at the window, I had the deeply unsettling feeling that someone had entered the warehouse from outside while I was occupied reviewing records. I stared at the door for several seconds, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. The warehouse covered more than 20,000 square meters and had several service entrances. In theory, there could be a simple explanation. Maybe a driver had entered looking for an employee. Maybe a company security officer had stopped by without informing me. But there was a problem. There was no on-site security that night. Only remote camera monitoring. Furthermore, any visitor was required to check in through the administrative reception area before accessing the interior. I grabbed my radio and attempted to contact the monitoring center. No one responded immediately. The silence from the radio only increased my anxiety. I decided to go down to the main floor and inspect the door myself. As I walked down the metal staircase, I began paying attention to sounds I normally ignored. The ventilation system seemed louder. The echo of my own footsteps seemed to travel throughout the entire building. And for the first time that night, I became fully aware of just how enormous the warehouse felt when it was completely empty. When I reached the loading dock area, I saw that the door was indeed open a few inches. Cold air was coming through the gap, causing a piece of packing plastic on the floor to sway gently. I approached slowly and looked outside. Darkness covered almost the entire yard. The few lights installed around the property illuminated only specific areas near the docks. The truck remained parked in the same distant position. I could not see anyone around it. I closed the door and checked the lock. It was unlocked. Not forced. Not broken. Simply unlocked. That worried me even more because it meant someone had opened it, using the internal mechanism or possessed legitimate access. While examining the lock, I heard a sound coming from inside the warehouse. A brief noise, like something bumping against a metal structure. I immediately turned toward the sound. Rows of industrial shelving stretched into the darkness, forming long, partially illuminated aisles. For a few seconds, I stared into that maze of corridors without seeing anything unusual. Then the sound happened again, this time farther away. I moved toward the noise, trying to stay calm. The warehouse stored a wide variety of goods, so there were dozens of aisles formed by tall shelving units packed with boxes and pallets. Some sections were completely hidden from view depending on where you stood. As I advanced, I began noticing something strange. Several motion-activated lights were turning on, sequentially farther ahead. Those lights normally remained off until someone entered the corresponding aisle. I stopped immediately. About 50 meters ahead, One light switched on. A few seconds later, another farther away lit up. Then another. It was exactly the pattern you would expect if someone were walking through the aisles. My heart began racing. I called out loudly, asking who was there. No response, only silence. Then, one of the lights switched off again. Shortly afterward, another went dark as well, as though whoever was moving had stopped somewhere outside my field of view. At that moment, I realized something that made me even more uncomfortable. Whoever was inside knew the layout of the warehouse very well. The movements were deliberate. They did not resemble someone who was lost or looking for help. Then I heard the most disturbing sound of the night. It did not come from the aisles in front of me. It came from behind me. A single footstep. Sharp, clear, much closer than any other noise I had heard up to that point. I spun around immediately. No one was there, but one of the lights near the loading dock area was still flickering after having just turned on, as if someone had passed through moments earlier. Instantly, I experienced that difficult-to-describe sensation when your brain realizes something is wrong, before you fully understand why. Up until then, I believed I was following a person who had entered from outside. In that instant, I began to suspect that there might be more than one person inside the warehouse, and that possibility changed everything. I was no longer trying to figure out who had opened the door. I was alone in an enormous building, surrounded by aisles with limited visibility, unable to contact the monitoring center, and with no idea how many people might be moving around inside. From that point forward, I stopped advancing through the aisles altogether. My instincts were telling me to return to the administrative office and lock the door behind me. I still held the radio, attempting to contact the monitoring center every few minutes, but all I got was static. As I slowly backed toward the loading docks, my eyes constantly shifted between the aisles ahead and the spaces behind me. The warehouse seemed different now. The shadows between the shelves looked deeper. Every small movement from the ventilation system caused plastic wrapping and labels to sway slightly. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored all of it. But in that situation, my mind tried to interpret every detail as a potential threat. When I finally reached the loading dock area again, I looked through the side window facing the yard. The truck was still there, in exactly the same place, in exactly the same position. No lights on, no doors open, no visible driver. By then, it had remained there far too long to be a simple delivery mistake. And that was when I noticed something else strange. The cab appeared empty. I could not see anyone through the windshield, even with the distant lighting reflecting off the glass. I ran back to the administrative office on the upper level and began reviewing the exterior cameras. I wanted to determine whether anyone had actually exited the truck. I rewound the footage to the moment the vehicle arrived. I watched it enter normally through the main gate and park in the dark section of the yard. Then I saw something that made me freeze. About 2 minutes after parking, a person exited from the passenger side, not the driver's side. The individual quickly walked out of the camera's frame. Shortly afterward, a second person climbed out from the rear section of the truck, then a third, and a few seconds later, a fourth. None of them wore transportation company uniforms. None carried clipboards or paperwork. All of them headed directly toward the warehouse. My heart immediately started pounding. I replayed the footage several times to make sure I was not misinterpreting it. 4 people had exited that vehicle. And at that moment, I was alone inside a massive warehouse with no idea where they were. The worst realization was understanding that while I had been following sounds and watching lights turn on among the shelves, those people had probably already been moving through the building for several minutes. The first thing I did was lock the office door. It was not reinforced, but at that moment, any barrier felt better than none. Then I grabbed my personal phone and called the police. I quickly explained that there was an unauthorized truck in the yard, and that at least 4 people had entered the warehouse without permission. The dispatcher instructed me to remain in a safe location until officers arrived. It sounded simple enough, but the problem was that I was not entirely sure the office I was sitting in was actually safe. It had windows facing the yard and a metal staircase providing direct access to the main floor. While waiting, I began monitoring the internal cameras. There were dozens scattered throughout the warehouse. I cycled through the different aisles, searching for movement. For several minutes, I saw nothing. Then a camera near the storage area captured a figure quickly crossing an aisle. Shortly afterward, another camera showed someone standing between two shelving units looking directly toward the lens. The image was distant and grainy, but it was clearly a person. I stared at the screen waiting for them to move again. Instead, they remained motionless for several seconds before slowly leaving the frame. Then something happened that genuinely terrified me. While watching the cameras, I heard a sound coming from the staircase outside the administrative office. One step, then another. Very slow, very close. My entire body froze. The metal staircase amplified every noise. I knew exactly where the sound was coming from. Someone was climbing the stairs. I immediately switched off the office light and moved away from the door. The footsteps continued for a few seconds and then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I could hear only my own breathing and the hum of the monitors. I waited to hear an attempt to open the door or a voice from outside. Nothing happened. Perhaps an entire minute passed that way. Then I heard a faint metallic sound, like someone touching the doorknob, not trying to force it open, just a light, deliberate touch, as if they wanted to confirm someone was inside. In that instant, I realized something deeply disturbing. I had never appeared on the exterior cameras. I had never gone outside to speak with anyone. Yet someone seemed to know exactly where I was. I remained motionless behind a desk, gripping my phone so tightly that my hand began to hurt. I listened carefully for any sound outside the door. For several seconds, there was absolutely nothing. Then I heard footsteps again, this time moving away along the metal walkway connecting the office to the rest of the mezzanine. I quietly rushed to the monitors and searched for the camera covering that area. It took a few seconds to find it. When the image appeared, I saw someone walking along the elevated corridor above the warehouse floor. The person wore a dark hooded jacket and kept their head lowered. They were not running. They did not appear to be searching for something urgently. They moved slowly, looking downward toward the storage areas. The behavior was far too strange. It did not resemble someone trying to steal merchandise quickly, nor did it resemble a lost driver. There was an unsettling calmness in the way the person moved. I continued watching until they disappeared behind a structural wall. A few seconds later, another camera captured a second individual appearing in a different aisle. They were spread throughout the warehouse, and they seemed to be acting in coordination. The next several minutes were probably the longest of my life. I remained focused on the cameras and the clock on my phone, waiting for the police to arrive. At one point, I noticed something that sent an immediate chill through my stomach. One of the cameras facing the loading dock area showed the side door that had been opened earlier. Now it was completely wide open, and through it, I could see another person entering the warehouse from the direction of the truck. That meant not everyone had exited the vehicle initially. There may have been more people involved than I originally thought. While watching that feed, I finally received a call from the police informing me that patrol units were entering the property. I ran to the window overlooking the yard. For the first time that night, I felt some relief when I saw red and blue lights reflecting off the snow in the distance. The truck remained parked exactly where it had been the entire time. But almost immediately after the patrol cars arrived, something curious happened. People began quickly exiting the warehouse through different side doors. I could see them running through the dark area near the rear fence. It was as if they knew the exact moment the police had arrived. When officers finally entered the building, I remained in the administrative office until they told me it was safe to come out. The search lasted more than an hour. They found clear signs that multiple people had been moving through the warehouse. There were footprints, open doors, and even some abandoned tools near a storage area containing electronics. However, no one was located inside the building. Part of the group had apparently escaped through the rear of the property before the perimeter could be secured. The truck was seized and taken for investigation. According to the police, it was using cloned license plates and contained empty compartments modified for cargo transport. The suspicion was that the group had been evaluating the facility for a larger theft at a later date. What continued to bother me afterward was another piece of information I received several days later. The footage clearly showed that one of the individuals had spent several minutes standing on the mezzanine walkway, looking directly at the administrative office door, without attempting to enter, without doing anything else, just watching. as if they knew exactly where I was the entire time. I quit that distribution center about 2 months later. Not solely because of that incident, but because the sense of isolation during overnight shifts never felt the same afterward. To this day, I believe I was lucky. If I had continued following those sounds between the shelves earlier that night, I probably would have ended up encountering the group alone, with no help nearby. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe they would have simply run away. But when I remember the footsteps behind me, the lights turning on one after another down the aisles and the doorknob moving outside the office, I get a different feeling. I have the impression that those people knew I was there long before I realized they were inside the warehouse. And that remains the most disturbing part of the entire story. Story 4. I was 34 years old when this happened, and I worked as a security guard at an office complex on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho. The property consisted of 3 corporate buildings connected by enclosed walkways and surrounded by a massive parking lot. During the day, hundreds of employees moved through the area, but after 10 at night it became almost completely empty. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 in the morning. Most nights I conducted my patrols alone. There was a remote monitoring center that watched the cameras, but physically I was the only employee present on site. I had worked at that complex for nearly 2 years and knew every hallway, every door, and even the schedules for when the climate control systems turned on and off. That particular night was especially cold. The parking lot was empty. The wind struck the glass facades and the interior corridors felt even quieter than usual. Up until around 2 in the morning, everything had gone exactly like any other routine shift. I was finishing an inspection on the second floor of Building B when the radio clipped to my shoulder emitted a burst of static. That was not unusual. Small interference issues occasionally occurred within the internal communication system. I kept walking without paying much attention. A few seconds later, I heard a male voice. It was low, calm, and seemed to be speaking through the same channel used by the security team. At first, I assumed it was someone from the monitoring center trying to contact me, but I quickly realized it was not. The voice said something like, "You just passed the conference room in the east hallway." I stopped immediately. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. I really had just passed a conference room in that hallway. I grabbed my radio and responded, asking who was transmitting. No reply came right away, only a few seconds of silence. Then the voice returned. This time it said, "Now you're standing near the coffee machine." I felt immediate discomfort, because I was indeed standing beside a small break area where employees used a coffee machine during the day. The coincidence was far too strange to ignore. I spent several seconds looking around the hallway trying to find a logical explanation. My first thought was that someone from the monitoring center was playing a tasteless joke. But that did not fit anyone on the team I knew. Besides, that particular hallway did not have cameras aimed directly at the area where I was standing. I knew that because part of my responsibilities involved periodically checking the blind spots in the system. I picked up the radio again and asked who was speaking. This time I was more direct. I said that the frequency was restricted to security personnel and that I needed immediate identification. There was only static for a few seconds. Then the voice responded calmly. It did not answer my question. Instead, it said, "You're looking behind you now." Instantly, I felt a chill in my stomach, because I had just turned my head to check the hallway behind me. My first reaction was to look up at the ceiling for a camera I might have forgotten about. There wasn't one. Not in front of me, not behind me. The hallway was empty. The office doors remained closed. The overnight lighting continued operating normally. Everything looked exactly the same as any other night, except for the voice. I kept walking because part of me still believed there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe someone was watching through a partially open office door. Maybe a technician was working somewhere without my knowledge. As I continued toward the end of the hallway, the voice spoke again, always in a low tone, always calm, and always describing exactly what I was doing. "You just checked the emergency exit. A few seconds later, now you're heading toward the walkway." I tried convincing myself it could still be a coincidence, but every new transmission made that explanation less believable. What bothered me most was the accuracy. These were not generic observations. The person seemed to be tracking my movements in real time. At one point, I stopped abruptly just to test it. I stood completely still in the middle of the hallway. About 5 seconds later, the voice transmitted again. "You stopped." That was enough to turn my curiosity into genuine concern. For the first time that night, I began to feel that someone might actually be inside the building watching me directly. I decided to completely change my patrol route. Instead of following my normal path, I entered a service stairwell that was rarely used during overnight hours. It was an area without cameras and without windows, used primarily by maintenance crews during the day. My intention was simple: determine whether the person would continue describing my movements even in a part of the building where almost nobody could see me. As I descended the stairs, the radio remained silent. For a few moments, I began to believe it was over. Then I heard the static again. A second later, the voice returned. "You're going down to the first floor." I stopped immediately on the landing between 2 flights of stairs. My heart raced instantly. The voice continued. "Now you're looking at the fire door." That was exactly what I was doing at that moment. I could feel the tension growing with every transmission. The problem was not merely that someone knew where I was. It was the growing sense that the person always seemed one step ahead, as if they knew exactly where I was going before I even got there. I reached the first floor and headed directly to an administrative area that remained closed at night. The hallway was empty. The office doors were locked. There was no sign of recent activity. As I walked, I studied reflections in the office windows, trying to determine whether someone was following me from a distance. I saw nothing, just silent hallways and fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor. Then the voice transmitted once again. This time it said something different. "You should check the monitoring room." The tone remained calm, almost casual. That made me even more uneasy. The monitoring room was located in the main building across an enclosed walkway. It housed the camera servers, access logs, and security systems. Very few people were authorized to enter it. For several seconds, I considered ignoring the message entirely. But the more I thought about it, the more I concluded that I needed to find out who was using that frequency. If someone had compromised the radio system, the answer was probably connected to the monitoring area. I crossed the walkway between the buildings, trying to stay aware of everything around me. The wind produced strange noises against the exterior glass panels. The metal structure of the walkway emitted occasional pops caused by temperature changes. Under normal circumstances, I would not have paid attention to any of it. But that night, every sound seemed to carry a different meaning. The radio remained silent for almost the entire walk. That made me even more nervous. I preferred hearing the voice to experiencing that absolute silence. When I finally reached the hallway leading to the monitoring room, I immediately noticed something wrong. The restricted access door was open. Not fully open, but enough to reveal a dark gap inside the room. I stopped instantly. That door was supposed to remain closed and locked at all times. Only supervisors and certain technicians had credentials to access it. My first thought was that an authorized employee had entered without informing me. But before I could even approach, I saw movement inside the room. A shadow crossed quickly through the gap. Immediately afterward, I heard the sound of an interior door closing somewhere deeper inside. I approached the entrance slowly, trying to listen for any additional sounds coming from within. The monitoring room was relatively large and divided into 2 sections. The first contained the camera monitors and network equipment. The second was a technical room housing servers, files, and access control systems. When I reached the door, I pushed it open carefully. The lights were on. The monitors displayed normal camera feeds from around the complex. At first glance, everything appeared normal, but the main chair had been pushed away from the desk as though someone had just stood up. On the counter sat an empty disposable cup that had not been there at the beginning of my shift. That immediately caught my attention because I had passed through the room a few hours earlier during a routine inspection. As I examined the area, I heard a metallic sound coming from the technical section in the back. It sounded like a door closing. I ran in that direction and found the second door still gently swinging, as though it had been pushed only moments before. The person I had seen through the gap had been inside just seconds earlier. I entered the technical area and found myself in a narrow corridor lined with server racks. The constant hum of cooling fans filled the space. The temperature was noticeably lower due to the refrigeration system. I called out loudly, asking who was there. No answer came. I continued forward until I reached the small access control room at the end of the corridor. The door was open. When I shined my flashlight inside, I saw something that made my stomach sink. One of the computers was open to a security camera management screen. Multiple windows had been manually opened. Some displayed common areas of the building. Others showed specific hallways I had passed through earlier that night. But the most disturbing detail was something else. Beside the keyboard was a printed sheet containing the schedules of my patrols. Not just for that night. There were records covering several previous days, approximate times, areas I typically inspected, intervals between patrols. It looked as though someone had been tracking my movements for weeks. At that moment, the radio emitted static again. The sound came so suddenly that I nearly dropped the device. The voice returned, but now it seemed closer. It was not only coming from the radio clipped to my shoulder. It seemed to echo from somewhere within the technical corridor itself. "You found the room." I froze completely. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and began illuminating every space between the server racks. No one was visible. The voice continued for a few more seconds. "You took longer today." Those were the last words I heard that night. After that, there was only silence. I immediately ran back out of the technical room and locked the area behind me. Then I called the police and my supervisor. While waiting for them to arrive, I remained inside the monitoring room, watching every camera feed at once. I had the constant feeling that someone was still somewhere inside the building, perhaps watching from a blind spot I did not know existed. When the police arrived, they conducted a complete search of all 3 buildings in the complex. The operation lasted nearly 2 hours. No one was found. However, the officers discovered something troubling. One of the maintenance doors located in the basement showed signs of recent use. It had not been forced open, but someone had managed to access the building through it multiple times without being detected. In addition, electronic records revealed repeated attempts to access the camera system during the previous weeks. They never identified the individual, nor did they determine how that person had managed to use the internal radio frequency. The strangest part came a few days later when technicians examined the equipment. They concluded that the voice transmissions had not originated from any radio registered to the company. To this day, there is no definitive explanation for what happened. I continued working as a security guard for a while afterward, but I never again felt comfortable conducting patrols alone in that complex. What continues to disturb me is not the intrusion itself. It is knowing that someone apparently knew my schedule, my routes, and my habits with a level of detail that would have been impossible for a casual visitor. And sometimes, when I remember that voice describing exactly where I was, I get the uncomfortable feeling that I was not the first person it had been watching. Story 5. I was 29 years old when this happened, and I worked in railroad maintenance in a rural area near Cheyenne, Wyoming. At the time, I worked many night shifts because most technical inspections were performed when rail traffic decreased. The location where I was working that night was not a conventional station. It was a small support structure used by maintenance crews, built decades earlier beside a set of secondary railroad tracks. There was an equipment room, a small office, a tool storage area, and little else. During the day, a few employees would show up, but during the overnight hours, there was normally only one person on site. That person was me that night. It was cold, although it wasn't snowing. The wind blew constantly across the open fields surrounding the station and produced that deep sound that seemed to pass straight through the building's metal walls. I was used to the isolation. I had spent hundreds of nights alone near the tracks. Because of that, when everything started, my first reaction was to try to find a normal explanation for what I was seeing. At around 2:40 in the morning, I was performing an inspection on some equipment installed near the main line. It was routine work. I was checking electrical indicators, recording readings, and inspecting signaling systems. While doing that, I heard the distant sound of wheels on tracks. That was not unusual by itself. Trains regularly passed through the area. The problem was realizing where the sound was coming from. I looked up and saw a light slowly approaching along the secondary track that ran behind the station. That immediately caught my attention because that line had been out of service for years. I knew that because it was part of the region's technical reports. The tracks were still physically there, but they were not used for regular traffic. Yet a train was moving along them that night. It was not moving fast. It did not look like a normal freight train. It moved slowly, almost as if it were performing some kind of maneuver. I watched as the rail cars passed through the darkness. I couldn't clearly identify any logos or numbers. A few minutes later, the lights disappeared into the distance. The sound of the rails faded back into the usual silence. But the scene continued to bother me because there simply should not have been any train on that line. After the train disappeared, I stood there for several seconds staring at the empty tracks, trying to understand what I had just seen. The first explanation that came to mind was that some special operation had been authorized without the local crew being informed. That had happened before in other regions. Communications did not always reach every employee immediately. Even so, it seemed strange. The train's speed, the time of night, and especially the track it used did not match any normal operation. I decided to finish the inspection quickly and return inside the station to consult the operational records. The walk back to the building was short, but along the way I began noticing how quiet the environment felt after the train had passed. The wind had died down, and even the metallic noises from the rails seemed less frequent. When I reached the small technical platform beside the station, something immediately caught my attention. One of the building's side doors was open, not wide open, but open enough that I could tell the difference even from a distance. My stomach dropped instantly. I had passed by that door less than 20 minutes earlier. I was absolutely certain it had been closed. I approached slowly, trying to convince myself that it had probably been the wind. But when I reached the entrance, I noticed the lock was disengaged. It was a heavy door. It was not the kind of door that simply swung open because of a gust of wind. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside the station. The interior looked exactly as I had left it. The fluorescent lights were still on. The tools remained stored away. The computers displayed the same monitoring screens. Even so, something felt different. Maybe it was just nerves, but I immediately had the sensation that someone had been there. The smell inside seemed slightly different. In addition to the usual odor of electrical equipment and dust, I caught something that resembled fresh cigarette smoke. That stood out because smoking was prohibited inside railroad facilities. I stood still for a few seconds listening. I heard no footsteps, no doors, only the constant hum of the electronic equipment. Even so, the feeling that I wasn't alone began growing rapidly. I went directly to the main room where the computers used for operational monitoring were located. My goal was simple: verify whether there was any record of that train. If a special authorization existed, it should appear in the system. I sat down at the terminal and began reviewing the circulation reports for that night. I spent several minutes cross-checking information, schedules, and operation codes. The more I searched, the stranger everything became. There was no scheduled movement for the secondary track. None. No maintenance, no equipment transfers, no operational testing. I reviewed the records more than once because I thought I might be checking the wrong section. The result was always the same. Officially, no train should have passed along that line that night. That was when I began feeling genuine concern, because now I had two problems with no reasonable explanation. First, a train using a decommissioned route. Second, a technical door standing open only minutes after the train had passed. For the first time, I started considering the possibility that the two things were related. While I was still reviewing the records, I heard a sound coming from the hallway connecting the office to the tool storage room. It wasn't loud. It sounded like something lightly bumping against a metal surface. I immediately turned my head. The hallway was empty. The light remained on. I watched for a few seconds without seeing anything. Then I stood up and went to investigate. The storage room was small. There were shelves full of equipment, cables, tools, and spare parts. When I entered, everything appeared normal at first glance. However, I quickly noticed something out of place. A toolbox that normally sat on a workbench was now on the floor near the rear door of the storage room. It might sound like an insignificant detail, but I had worked there for years. I knew exactly where everything belonged. The toolbox had not simply fallen, it looked as though someone had moved it. From that moment on, I began checking every room in the station much more carefully. And during that inspection, I found something that made me even more uncomfortable. There were fresh, muddy footprints on the floor near the rear technical entrance. Not many. Just a few partial prints, but enough to indicate that someone had entered the building not long before. The footprints led toward the interior hallway and then disappeared where the floor became drier. The station did not receive visitors, especially not during the overnight hours. I stared at the marks, trying to estimate how long they had been there. They looked recent. The mud had not completely dried yet. I grabbed my radio and contacted the Regional Operations Center to report the situation. I eventually reached a supervisor who confirmed something important. No maintenance, inspection, or transportation crews were authorized in that area at that hour. When I mentioned the train on the secondary track, he went silent for several seconds and asked me to repeat what I had said. Then he responded that such a thing was impossible according to the operational records. The conversation ended with him saying he would investigate and call me back within a few minutes. When I set the radio down, I was alone again inside the station. That was when I heard another sound. This time it did not come from the storage room. It came from outside. A brief crunching noise, like gravel being stepped on. I slowly approached one of the side windows and looked outside. The lighting around the station was limited. A few security lights partially illuminated the platform and sections of the tracks. Everything else was submerged in darkness. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed movement near the edge of the illuminated area. It looked like a person walking along the decommissioned tracks. The distance was too great for me to identify details. I could only see a dark silhouette moving slowly between the light poles. The strangest part was that the person seemed to be following the exact direction where the train had passed earlier. I watched, unable to decide whether I should go outside to investigate or remain inside the station. The silhouette continued walking for a few seconds before disappearing once again into the darkness beyond the lights. At that moment, I began feeling deeply uneasy. It did not seem like someone had simply wandered by the station by chance. The impression I got was that the person had used the train's passage to approach unnoticed, and now they were moving through the area knowing exactly where they were going. I continued watching through the window for nearly a full minute, waiting for the silhouette to reappear. Nothing happened. The darkness surrounding the tracks became completely still once again. I still considered going outside to investigate, but the more I thought about it, the worse the idea seemed. The station was isolated. The nearest building was several miles away. If there really was someone moving around the area without authorization, I would be alone outside in a place full of structures, old tracks, and blind spots. I decided to remain inside the station and monitor everything through the windows and external cameras. That was when I noticed another strange detail. One of the cameras aimed at the secondary tracks was out of position. The image displayed nothing but part of the dark sky and the top of a light pole. Normally, that camera pointed directly at the decommissioned line. I knew that because I had used those images countless times during previous inspections. Someone had apparently adjusted its position manually, and that was not something that happened on its own. While checking the other cameras, I heard my radio emit the tone indicating an incoming call. It was the supervisor I had spoken to earlier. He informed me that the operations center could not locate any record related to the train I had described. According to him, no operator responsible for the area's rail lines had authorized traffic on that route. When I mentioned again the presence of someone near the tracks, he recommended that I remain inside the station and wait for a support team that was being dispatched to investigate. That brought me some relief. At least I would not have to deal with the situation alone much longer. However, only a few seconds after ending the call, I heard a noise directly outside the office wall. It sounded like someone walking across the gravel on the platform. Slow, deliberate footsteps, clear, very close. The sound traveled along the entire exterior wall before fading in the direction of the main entrance. My heart immediately began racing. I rushed to another window that provided a view of the front platform. When I looked outside, I saw no one, but the main door was slightly open. That was impossible. I had checked all the entrances only minutes earlier. For several seconds, I stood there trying to decide what to do. Then I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the station's main hallway. The noise came from inside the building, not from outside. I immediately turned toward the hallway. The silence that followed was almost worse than any noise. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked toward the station's reception area. Everything appeared empty. No movement, no shadows, no sounds. However, when I reached the front entrance area, I found something that had not been there before. Fresh, muddy footprints. The same kind I had seen near the rear technical door. Now they appeared near the front entrance as well. That meant someone had passed through that area only moments earlier. And judging by the pattern of the tracks, it seemed that the person had been moving through the station's interior rather than entering it for the first time. That was when I heard vehicles approaching along the access road. Their headlights appeared through the front windows. It was the support team sent by the operations center. I had never felt so relieved to see other employees arriving. I explained everything that had happened, and together we conducted a complete search of the station and the immediate surrounding area near the tracks. We found no one. However, we found enough evidence to confirm that someone had really been there. There were fresh footprints near the secondary line, signs that the camera had been manually repositioned, and marks around the rear technical door. Days later, an internal investigation concluded that the train I saw was most likely a set of railroad equipment operating irregularly outside official records. I never received a full explanation for that. What still bothers me most is not the train itself, it is the sequence of events. Someone apparently used that unexpected movement to approach the station unnoticed, entered the building while I was working alone, and disappeared before the support team arrived. If I had not noticed the open door or the footprints, I might never have known that another person had been there with me that night.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.